We're going to move on now to our next speaker, and this definitely continues the conversation. I'd like to introduce you to Nina Levin. Nina Levin is Vice President of Client Services at Within3. She had wealth of experience in the client-facing experience. She directs and identifies activities, setting KPIs, and supporting her clients from Within3. The title of our talk is Maximising the Omnichannel Ecosystem for Medical Affairs. So I hope, Nina, you can build on all those questions and conversations we've just had and get us more into the details of omnichannel ecosystems.
I hope so. Thank you very much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I am Nina Levin. I'm one of the VPs. I head up the team in the EMEA region, and I've worked across all sorts of different things. So I'm very interested by this discussion. I've worked both client and agency side before working for Within3. So I look forward to your questions. Please do ask as we go, and I will lead you through. So I think ultimately, Paola and the questions that have come through have already highlighted a lot of this. The process of transforming the data into something that we can actively engage with can be very difficult. We have lots of different people gathering this data. We've got lots of people that we're gathering it from, and it's obviously important for us to be able to use it correctly and to leverage that and streamline the use of it across all of our different teams. We don't want to be wasting time, resource, and energy in repeating these things. So routinely, you're going to be engaging the same people. Sometimes we go to people that we already know. That's going to potentially reinforce what we think we already know rather than challenging our views. And of course, challenging our views is an important thing when we're trying to get our strategies right and trying to get that information correct. And sometimes we're also not engaging the right people. We're not engaging groups, perhaps because we didn't even know they existed based on the ways that we're looking for them. So we might not be getting the right people to engage for those tactics in the first place before we even start to talk about which channels we then use to engage them through. So even once we've onboarded them, we might find that the participation is inconsistent. That could be, as Paola says, because we're not listening to personal preferences for the channels. We're not listening to that feedback. We're not looking at the data that we've collected historically and learning from it. Or it could be, as we've said, that we've not identified the right people and that we need to obviously look at that a bit better. And then, of course, we have the outputs. So we might have raw transcripts from hour-long calls. We've all been on countless hour-long Zoom webcasts, whether it's Teams, whatever you want to use. Those video conferences have huge outputs. If you're doing face-to-face meetings, let's take an advisory board as an example, you've got a recording or you've got medical writers' notes that then take weeks to pass into actionable insights. And we obviously need to get better at that to make sure that we don't just have all of this valuable information, but that we can actually use it. So alongside all of that, I'm creating all these problems, but these are all things that we've faced. We then also have that silo. So Paola was just talking about obviously how to share that information across the teams, making sure that, if we've got someone in one particular country or in a global team, that information is being disseminated out to the other teams so that they're not repeating activities. We're not going back and forth on the same things again. So really making sure that we're breaking down those silos as well. So where it all starts is how we source that information, of course, and how we go. And there are lots of different things. We'll be looking at referral patterns, we'll be looking at research, patient outcomes, competitor data, congresses. I hope everyone's looking at congress data, I'm sure you are, and study data as well, of course. You've then got social trends. So what are the physicians and the patients doing? What are we seeing in that information that they're sharing quite openly in a lot of cases? Making sure that we're listening to that as well. And then making sure that based on all of that, that we are actually talking to the right people. So are we confident that we've engaged the right people? Are you confident that you've engaged the right people? And are you challenging your own thoughts around how you found them in the first place? So I mentioned I've done all sorts of things, and one of these is typical KOL identification, as I'm going to call it. So this is the slightly old-fashioned route of looking at, identifying those people through impact factors, publications, how prolific they are. And we end up that way, unfortunately, with the same people quite often. So we end up with those sort of top tiers. It doesn't necessarily help us to nurture those rising stars that we might be seeing. And it doesn't give us those different viewpoints always. It also sometimes locks down those opportunities for cross-therapy area or cross-experience information that we can share. So really, what we need to do is look at those more precise and targeted approaches. So we talk about influence, of course. It's something we're all aware of, how people influence each other through the course of their work and through the course of their own personal interactions, of course. So it's looking at not only that data that we would have compiled with, how experienced someone is, what they've done in the past, those publications, how they're presenting, are they already at congresses and presenting with us? Do they work with our competitors? What other subjects are they interested in? But also then taking all of the other data, so social network analytics, for example, and really applying all of this information on top of a comprehensive data set first. So looking at treatment information that we can glean, social media information, transparency data, and so on, and looking at, okay, what does this actually mean in terms of how we're ranking these people within the networks, and are they the right people to engage? Just because they're ranked lower than we expected doesn't mean that they're the wrong people to engage. It might be that they're exactly the right people, or they might even be higher than we anticipated in terms of their influence based on this additional data. So you'll identify niche leaders, who are the people that obviously are important to the flow of the information across regions and subgroups. But amongst that, you've also got other influencers who will be adjusting in their roles in the in our analytics, of course, and how we engage with them. And they might challenge what we're thinking about and how we approach things. And then we've got the connectors, who might be on the periphery of this particular topic we want to discuss, but can then connect us out to other people who can influence that discussion and obviously provide you with that data. So I think when we talk about omni-channel engagement, we shouldn't just be talking about the tools and those different channels we have to engage people, but how we're actually looking for those people in the first place. Are we using the right channels to identify them? And are we using the channels that we already have access to then build on that and critique what we're doing and refine it further? So that then obviously helps us to fill out the rest of the network. We can understand who these people are, how they interact with each other. We might identify that this gentleman here is someone that we need to nurture our relationships with further in order to build him into our further activities. And there might also be those crossovers at the global and the country level that we can also leverage in these ways. So once we've then worked out who it is we want to engage and who we should be engaging, and obviously that should be an ongoing activity, that shouldn't just be a one-off, okay, I've got my list, I'm happy. But how do we then engage them? So we've got all these different channels, and ultimately we can simplify it right down into engagement venues being real-time, so face-to-face meetings, things where we are required to be live. We've also then got the virtual real-time, so webcasts like today's, of course, and pretty much every call I imagine that we've all been on today. So those could be those webinars where someone's going to present at you and give you information, and then webcasts like this where we'll have that more conversational approach. And of course, again, those one-to-one web meetings as well, or smaller niche groups. And then we've got the anytime. So again, Paula, I'm sorry, I'm picking on everything you've just said because it feeds in beautifully to what we're talking about. But there are all these different channels that we have access to, and it's whether they are the right channels. So a hybrid approach is great. Some people will be extremely vocal in a webcast. They'll ask lots of brilliant questions. They'll ask lots of interesting questions, and they'll challenge each other. But just as you would see in a face-to-face meeting, sometimes there are people who are a little bit quiet, a bit reticent, and yet they've got those absolute gems of information that we need to uncover. And so we need to find the right environments for them to thrive in as well. So often in the work that I do on a daily basis, we'll have a client who say, oh, we had Dr. X, they were just silent when we've had them face to face. And yet we go into a virtual environment and they're perhaps not the chattiest on a webcast, but when we get them into online discussions, they are suddenly the most prolific user. They are sharing all of their information because it gives them that moment to stop and think. And they feel that protection of being able to really consider what they're saying before they engage. And of course, I'm talking about physicians as the example because predominantly as medical affairs teams, that's who we will start engaging. But of course, we've got a wealth of people that we need to engage with. You're going to have crossover with study groups, with investigators. You've mentioned your MSLs for training. You need to think about how best to leverage their time because we don't want to be taking them off the road. We want to give them the tools that they need. The physicians, of course, patients and caregivers, whether they can actually physically go to a meeting. Is it appropriate from a confidentiality perspective? Thinking about how we protect them as well and make them more comfortable. And then, of course, you've got your internal strategic teams, your compliance teams, and others. So there are lots of people that we need to think about their preferences for and really make sure that we're looking at this in the right way so that we're getting the right information back and we're engaging them continuously and ultimately feeding all of those learnings back into the strategy of how we then engage them again, so that we're leveraging all of those touch points. And of course, once we've done that, once we've engaged with them, we need to think about the actual insights. So I talked about silos at the very top of the presentation. It's all well and good creating this data, gathering this information from people, but we need to ensure that that we have a way of using it, that we have the right tools in place. So you'll see I've got Viva in here. We've been talking about Viva, again, very pertinent. We know that Viva is at the center of a lot of what the pharmaceutical industry does and a lot of other industries, and it's important that we're feeding into those systems that you're using. You don't want to be creating more tools, more things for the team to use and to learn. We need to leverage the right things at the right time. So getting all of those live, those hybrid elements, those video conferences and meetings, and feeding them in to discover the right information. So how do we analyze that? Because that could be transcripts, that could be recordings. From a human hour perspective, that's a lot of time potentially. And I can tell you from experience back in the day when we didn't have artificial intelligence and natural language processing, it took me a long time to do that sort of thing and pull out those nuggets of information and then look at it and really critique it to go, is this what's going to feed into our strategy? What does it mean in terms of what we need to do next and how we do it? So we can use all these tools, advanced life sciences, natural language processing. So using the artificial intelligence and the technology available to us to feed all of that information that we're gathering into it to then churn out the answers that we need. Of course, you then need a human eye on it. So data analysts to look at it, and your teams as strategists and with the understanding that you have, of course, as the experts in the topic, but then to field that out to the various areas that it needs to go to. So interpreting it for the field force, feeding it into your internal communications, putting it into the CRM for those additional touch points, call centers, and so on. And just to give you an idea of what that could look like, because it's all well and good talking about language processing and all the rest of it, it's really pulling out those key insights. So using those aggregate results to tell you a story about the data. And then, of course, you can read that story, you can interpret it, you can look at the data in detail and pull it apart. So identifying those specific terms, looking at the sentiment overall of what you're doing and being able to look at that not just on a single session scale, but on a very broad scale across your various activities. And then, of course, identifying what we need to do next. What are those key actionable insights that we're identifying? Where are the areas that we should be focusing next? So I've seen in the chat there's a question about an example of using this with patients and caregivers, and I wish now that my case study was a different one, because I do have such a case study. Liz, I would be happy to follow up with you separately about that and to talk about it in more detail. We do a lot of work with patients and caregivers, and in our particular field, so as the company within 3, we anonymize what we do. We protect the patients. We have had situations where we've been able to bring them into discussions with physicians, and the feedback has always been that this is such a refreshing change to bring them together to have those discussions, because it brings them that perspective that they wouldn't necessarily see. And that could be individual patients and caregivers, it could be a group of them, or it could be patient advisory groups as well. So we do lots of different things. Now, as I say, my example is not that, but I am going to talk to you about an advisory board with physicians in oncology. We've gone for Europe, but of course we're a global team, so lots of different examples that we could have chosen to bring to this. So typically, we're trying to find information that we don't already have. We want to understand the unmet needs, and in this case, it was the treatment of a type of cancer in European patients. And after gathering that information, the team needed to review the scientific statements for their chemotherapy drugs. So making sure that those statements were accurate. Did they actually resonate? Were they right? Were they understood? And were they actually coming across in the right way? I think it's all well and good saying they're clear and understood, but are people interpreting them in the way that we need them to? Now, the advisors, unsurprisingly, with the European Advisory Board, were across different countries. And while English, of course, is typically used as the common business language, they didn't share a common language. So we had people who were not so confident to be able to engage in a second language. So we held hybrid meetings. We had 2 virtual advisory boards. We had calls in amongst those to present data. And ultimately, in the first, they gathered the feedback about those treatment approaches. So really gathering information about the expertise of the oncologists, their understanding of the treatment options and approaches that they had available. And then they further developed those scientific statements with them and reviewed them again with the advisors. So not just saying, right, we've got the information, we think we understand what you've said, and this is the answer, but going back and saying, right, this is what we think you've said. Have we got this right? So continuing to hone that. And typically we'll see this happen and then we'll see it revised. So every time that you have a new set of messaging to come out, you'll see these sessions happen again and again. Now you can see it was 102 questions, which is quite a large number for an advisory board, but over the course of those 2 sessions, obviously it was significantly reduced. The average, of course, across those 2 was different. And the team were given time. So during an overtime session, they have a period, typically a couple of weeks, but given the size of this topic, it may have been longer. Steering committees, for instance, will have cycles of activity that have a longer period. And they could engage at a time that was convenient to them. So 24 hours a day over that period, they could come in. And you can see we gathered 414 responses and 146 pages of transcript. So we're gathering all of those verbatim answers. The team have time to come in, look at each other's responses, build on it, enter into conversation. Moderators in the team will be able to trigger those conversations, ask clarifying questions, just as you do in those live meetings. And of course, calls around those. So webcasts will allow us to also build on that. But you'll appreciate 414 responses from oncologists are typically extremely detailed. And you can see from 146 pages, that was indeed the case. So it's important that we look at how to analyse that. And that's where that artificial intelligence can become extremely helpful. You know, we produce executive summaries of this information with those actionable insights, but it's helping to then share that information more broadly across your teams so that you can build on that. So it was a European level advisory board, but all of that information that was gathered was useful and needed to be then devolved down to each of the countries as well that the team was working across. So I'm going to pause. I'm sorry, I'm monitoring chat just out of habit. But how do we manage AE and PV reporting for transcripts? It's a good question. So, of course, adverse event reporting and pharmacovigilance is an important thing. Our clients are responsible as the topic experts for that. But we do monitor. We take regular adverse event reporting and pharmacovigilance training for our different clients. And we can also use keywords within the system. So if there are particular areas of concern, then we can highlight those and the system will automatically hold comments back. We can also delay the release of them if we need to for moderator review. You'll appreciate that would impact the fluency of the discussion though. So we'll look at the best way to handle that based on the concern. Christine, I hope that answers your question, but please feel free to dig in on that one. So that's everything really. So actually that question was perfectly timed. So in summary, ultimately, we need to make sure that we are, before we even think about the channels we want to engage through, that we're selecting the right people. So that actually starts with looking at the ways that they're engaging and what we want to engage with them on. We then need to connect with them in the right ways and at the right frequency. Make sure that they're satisfied with what we're doing. Make sure that the quality of the discussion and the dialogue is there, that we're actually getting the information, not just getting the answers that we expect, but we're actually challenging ourselves with that. And then, of course, taking that through to discovering what to do. So have we understood that information? Have we processed it correctly? And how do we apply this to make the best strategic decisions across not only the area we're looking at initially with those activities, but across the enterprise itself? So I shall pause. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Nina. That's excellent. I was going to hand over for questions, but you've answered them all. I wonder if anyone would like to add. Oh, yes. We do have Marta has asked a question. Marta, would you like to ask your question in person?
Yes, sure. So thank you so much for this interesting presentation. So I wanted to ask whether you have any experience in running webinars or similar activity directly on social media, and if so, how would you manage any adverse event reporting, and how would you support a company in approaching this type of activity on social media? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. So firstly, yes, we run webinars frequently. We have a webcast support team or webcast studio team who are focused on that element. So typically we will be monitoring and reporting as we are required to within the requirements of all of our clients. So we follow the same rules and regulations that everyone else does on that. So reporting the minute we have the information, making sure that we're reporting as quickly as possible with the right information through the channels that we've been asked to. Obviously, when we're running these webinars and these webcasts, we're doing them on behalf of a particular client and a client lead. So we are also feeding that information back to them so that they are aware of it. So we've got two different ways that we're working on that. Now, your reference to social media, I just want to sort of clarify on that one. We don't work on social media ourselves. We are a platform. We are so Within3 is a software company. So we provide a secure place to have these conversations, to hold those webcasts and so on. So we're not using social media, so we're not so worried about those external engagements from our perspective, because we're in that closed environment that is secure and regulatory compliant.
Great. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much for the question. And thank you, Nina, for that very insightful talk. That was excellent.